Hi everyone, Simon from Harma Studio. Been a while, but I'm back, at least for this video. Maybe I will be gone for a year again after this, who knows. Anyway, today I want to talk about the impact of good composition. I know there is like an underlying trend lately that seems to favor more and more the theoretical aspect in the learning process rather than the pure technical and software one. But this wave is still freaking too slow and shallow in my opinion, considering how critical the topic is. So lately I was toying with the idea on how to show, in the simplest way, the power of composition. And so I came up with this simple idea that goes as follows. I'll be using the exact same scene and assets, all coming from Chaos Cosmos, and do two images. One that is leveraging the common errors I see in typical images posted on the internet or in the workshops that I run with students, for instance, and one that would leverage the basics of composition knowledge, thus fixing those typical errors. We'll also go a little bit beyond to see why this even matters. Having the exact same scene with ready-made assets helps in discarding the importance of the technical aspect in the quality of an image and focus on other moving parts, which is composition. This, of course, is an oversimplified take on what composition truly is, since it is true that to an extent composition does encompass some of the technical aspects and quality of an image, like more refined textures, means like higher detail frequency and has an impact on perception, thus on composition, for instance. But why make it more complicated when we can just keep it simple and still retain some of the subtleties? So basically the scene will be the same for both images. All 3D models are from Chaos Cosmos, all textures are from Chaos Cosmos Material Library. Both images are using default rendering settings. Both images are using a simple V-Ray dome light plus V-Ray sun setup. The only thing that will change the two images are object placement, camera settings, and lighting hierarchy, basically moving the sun, the settings of the sun, and potentially adding additional lights. So the subject is a simple wabi-sabi inspired scene. The subject is purposefully simplified with few elements in the images, focus on a specific type of architecture, high ceilings, nice wooden textures, Zen undertone, if that means anything. There are like those typical translucent partitioning and trees in the adjacent garden. As I mentioned earlier, the entirety of the scene is done with Chaos Cosmos assets, sometimes slightly edited in terms of shape and with materials, and Chaos Cosmos materials. So putting together the scene took probably around like 30 minutes after gathering the right references. And my point is, this is a simple scene, and the quality of the end image lies in the way the scene is depicted, not in the time spent on making bespoke assets and hand painting textures and the likes. So here are the two images we'll consider for this little exercise. Which one do you think does the best job? And so just keep in mind which image you think is the most well composed when it comes to depicting the few features of the space, as well as the atmosphere, and which image also has the least compositional mistakes. So here they are again. Do you like better image 1 or image 2? Let's dive in and start with image 1. So image 1 is basically we have first a wide aspect ratio. So we're at like a 16:9, pretty basic aspect ratio. The thing that happens is that this is a pretty like elongated thing, which actually does not really match with the actual space of the project or the space that we're living in, because this is more based on some sort of square. Another thing that is happening as well is that we have a very short focal length. What happens with a short focal length is that you get a lot of distortion, and especially in the foreground, even in which you do frontal views, you do have quite a bit of distortion and very elongated perspectives. We have a very basic rule of thirds system that is organizing a little bit where some of the elements of the image are stopping. So nothing super fancy, but it works. We have very strong and sharp shadows that are like entering the space with pretty sharp edges. One thing that happens though is that we also have light in the foreground here, we have light in the middle ground here, and we have light in the background here. So there's no real separation between those three parts of the image. There's actually also one thing that we can notice is that we have pretty low contrast between the, let's say, part that is in the dark and the part that is in the sun. This is not necessarily a bad thing. What it means is that it's pretty homogeneous in its, let's say, value management, which means that we're going to have more, like a more softer feel in the way we look at the image. Because if you have like stronger contrast, it means that you're going to have a stronger or more dynamic way of looking at the project. One thing in terms of composition, when we go a little bit more into details, is that there's a lot of what we call like tangents, or like the absence of FGR, which is like figure ground relationship. What I mean by that is that you have like elements here that are like tangential. You have almost zero contrast between this element and this element, which makes this area hard to read. You have like some elements here that are structural elements behind that are like overlapping with like secondary elements of the sort of like partitioning system. So on top of that, you have also some sort of like downward looking or downward going, shadows, which in classical painting tends to be perceived as like negative and all that stuff. You have a decently legible diagonal system or triangle here that is like working quite well. One thing also that is a little bit less on the good side of this image though is the aspect of what I call like edge flickering. So it's basically when you're close to an edge and there's like little or elements that are happening that are like cropped in a way that sort of creates a lot of visual tension. Here we have that a lot with this element that is cropped, with this element that is like not really acting as anything because it's like very small. We have also something that happens pretty often. Here it's like subtle, but not subtle enough so that it actually becomes disturbing, but you can see that our frontal view is not really frontal, and you have like more distance here than you have distance here. And this creates a sort of like tension with the upper part of the image, because you can see that this is, instead of being perfectly parallel, you have this sort of like little slanted perception of the wall. And one last thing that we can talk about is the fact that we have this sort of like very homogeneous, let's say, color palettes. You have like tiny bit of blues here, but most of all we're having like very warm tones, with some browns, yellows. So yeah, something pretty warm basically, but it has this sort of like, there's not much contrast happening and there's not much interest, let's say. Everything is very homogeneous and we're not really looking at anything in particular in that image. There's no like super clear hierarchy. So this is just like for a reference to know this is how the 3D looks. So you have, this is like our camera here, like some of the tables that are placed. This is the sun that is like entering. So nothing special and nothing that is like added here, despite the fact that we're supposed to have like contextual trees. This is the second image. So let's keep going with the same exercise and look at this image and see how maybe it does a better job at depicting the project. So first, let's start with aspect ratio. Here we have square aspect ratio. What happens is that it does relate to a lot of elements within the image. You have this sort of like element here that is a square. You have all those things here that are square. You have those elements that are like kind of squarish as well. You have all the elements on the floor, like the sort of tatami thing, even though tatami is not supposed to be a square, but in that case here, they are squares. So it relates better to the space. Another thing that happens with square aspect ratio is that they are more balanced. Admire this beautiful handwriting, but they're more balanced. And what happens is that it relates more to this idea of, let's say, Zen, and the way we want to like depict this project that is like something very simple, very subtle, very quiet and all that stuff. Another thing that is happening as well is that we went from a sort of like 20-ish, I think it was, and the other one, to something that is more like, and this has to completely change the way the distortion are perceived. And what happens is that we're closer to what we would call like a human eye view, which basically is closer to how you would actually perceive the project. In that case, we're not really dealing with any actual grid system. There might be some rule of thirds somewhere, but it is not really how this image was composed. We're more using, let's say, like stronger elements, stronger lines, and also this sort of highlighting some elements in order to get like some sort of different visual weights. One thing that you can notice also is that we have a much softer light. What is happening is that instead of having the light like entering like this, we have it like perfectly parallel, or perpendicular rather, to the facade. What happens is that this sort of emphasizes, again, this sort of like geometrical perception of the project. Instead of having like weird diagonals that we don't need, we're like really going full on with the sort of like actual geometry of the space. One thing you can notice also is that the edges of our shadows are like much, much softer. And what happens is that when you have a softer edge, you have a softer contrast, and you have a softer feel overall with the image. This softer feel is also emphasized with some sort of atmospheric, like environmental fog that is like super, maybe not subtle enough, but like quite subtle in the image, and it helps in selling something that is a bit more like atmospherical and quiet and zen and let's say peaceful and calm. Another thing that is happening is that you have the shadow here that is like working with this foreground that helps in actually blocking the lower part of the image and dragging you or driving you inside the image. This was not happening in the first image, because here you can see that we have light and light. So it means that this has the same weight as this one, which is not really interesting for us. So here we have a clear differentiation between the foreground and the middle ground and background. And what happens is that it creates more focus around this area. Another thing also is that you have this sort of nice cast shadows from surrounding trees. Also, so it means that you have a sort of contextual suggestion from the surrounding. One thing that is also interesting is that the fact that it's softer light means we can grab more details from the outside, because we can suggest more of the surrounding trees. More into details, you can notice here we have this sort of like depth of field effect. What it happens is that by creating contrast in terms of focus, it means we can refocus our eyes on what is actually in focus or sharp. So what it means is that we're still retain some interesting detail and suggest elements of like props and materials and different elements in the scene, but they don't catch too much attention. Another thing that is happening in terms of lighting, so we have this sort of soft light that is quite nice and creates like a nice warm feeling, and we have some additional accent lights that play with the specularity of the different elements of like ceramics. This one, for instance, even though it's like a tiny detail, is added by like a simple light that is hidden, and that creates a sort of specular aspect and gives some dimensionality to that element in the foreground. Here's the same, it helps in reading the sort of curves of this ceramics, and the same happens here. So it basically creates this sort of like subspace here that is quite interesting. The thing is, in terms of hierarchy, it adds something, but at the same time, it doesn't deter the impact of the actual soft light soft natural light that we want to have. Another thing that is happening by having this sort of like softer light and softer way of working is that we create more, how would it be called, like a double tone or like a tonal contrast between the warmer area and the colder area. And what happens is that this creates a sort of nice, let's say, dialogue between this area and this area, and it creates like more dynamism in the image. But the thing is that you have this sort of nice balance between basically what is coming from outside is like cold, and like area here also that is quite cold, then the warmth of the sun entering and all that stuff. So here, just to give a little bit of an idea, is that even though we're like dealing with a let's say Unreal project, or not Unreal, but like a Unreal space, because we're in a 3D environment. So here there's a little completely random box that helps in casting shadows in the foreground so that we can separate the foreground from our background in our image. There's also like all the different trees that are like casting shadows that are interesting. And you can see that the sun is actually a little bit more that rather than how it was earlier. So what technically changed from image 1 to 2? Basically, we changed the aspect ratio. We had a softer light. We have like context suggestion. We have new tonal contrast. We have lighting hierarchy. We added atmospherics, depth of field, and there's the FGR that I forgot to talk about. But basically, here you can see, for instance, that the atmospherics that we have creates a clearer separation of elements. We also moved elements that were tangential so that they are not tangent anymore. We have this thing that overlaps better. And the fact that we, like this, for instance, is not perfectly aligned. And the fact that we have this type of thing creates more depth in the image, because if everything overlaps, it creates weird tensions and like unclear overlaps between different planes in the image. Whereas if you have like clear difference in values, clear difference in like basically contrasts, or not perfect alignment, it means that then you can understand better how the scene works. Also, for people that didn't get it, option 2 was better than option 1. If you were wrong, it's fine, but I'd still be curious to hear what made you think that option 1 was better than option 2. But so where does the actual difference really lie? Just like good VFX is invisible, good composition is also invisible. What it does is to draw you in the image in a subtle yet compelling and efficient manner. The second image does have like several extra layers of information that happen both at the primary and secondary vision of the image, thus conveying to the end viewer like additional levels of depth and complexity and understanding and feeling for the project. The many little artifacts that I mentioned on the first image, while they could be considered like details, when put together actually compound into noticeable effects of creating like noise in the image, thus keeping the viewer from focusing on what actually matters in the image and experiencing the space in a completely different way. Another aspect that is particularly important is for the artist is that having an understanding of all these elements, how each parameter of framing, lighting, and coloring impacts the final image, will help you in leading the conversation with the client by actually always pointing out the way the image will be read by the final viewer and how it will or will not tie back with the original intent or brief from the client. And also, anchoring the conversation in more unbiased concepts like the ones of data-driven perception is important if you want to not just argue about mere opinions with your client. So is image 2 the only good option? Of course, just look at this beauty. They can't be any other one, right? No, I'm kidding. Though I can say in a sort of objective way that image 2 will do a better job than image 1 at conveying all the little specificities and subtleties of the space. It doesn't mean that image 2 is flawless or that image 2 is the only way of conveying those ideas. In the end, what we end up doing is just comparing the options we come up with at the time of the project. And unfortunately, it can happen that later down the road, when revisiting the project, we come up with a more original and compelling solution. As I emphasized a few times, image 1 and image 2 only differ in the way the scene was lit and how the camera was placed, and a few settings changed. The model and textures are the exact same. So does that mean that the technical aspect of an image is entirely irrelevant? Of course not. I think there is two moments where the technical aspects are important. It is important at first to reach what I would call the current standards. You want materials, lighting, and geometries to look realistic enough to be believable. Once you reach that point, most of the heavy lifting will then be done by composition principles rather than the technical fine-tuning. If we take the image 1 to the next level with incredible materials and super high poly assets, it will not take away the fact that the aspect ratio is not suiting the space geometry, that there are multiple areas where there is unnecessary tensions, that the light doesn't sell the space in a legible way, and that the multiple instances of edge flickering are taking away the viewer's attention from what matters. The second moment when the technical accuracy becomes important again, though, is once your broad composition principles and general details are in place. Then it is true that refining materials, adding details and the likes can enhance the final perception of the image. One thing I want to mention, though, is that those details need to be added while having composition principles in mind. What do I mean by that? So yeah, composition and perception are like a rabbit hole, and you can really refine down to like details of mere pixels if you want. So when you start adding like details, imperfections, refine the polys on an asset, all this should be done while keeping in mind how it impacts the final perception of the image and ideally how they will benefit the final composition. A quick example, but correcting tiling in a texture in an image isn't important because it's just more technically accurate. It's important because patterns and repetition have a specific visual weight in composition, and it might detract the attention from what matters in your image. A tile texture that is in the dark and therefore not really visible has like barely any impact on your image. So it doesn't really change the viewer experience. Only if it's like clearly legible, like in the lighter part of your image, does it start to have an impact on the end viewer and thus needs fixing, making it like the technical accuracy relevant in the whole discussion. So yeah, I hope this little example helps you in understanding the fact that the technical aspect of an image can really only take your image so far, and that only composition principles can really push your image further, give it more depth and power, and give you more material to work from when you're selling your ideas to your clients. So technical accuracy should really only help you to get to the baseline necessary for realism and then to fine-tune composition through compositional details amendments. But it will never be able to do the heavy lifting of making an image meaningful and successful. Should you want to explore in depth the many concepts that exist in composition, how it relates to intent, light, color, and framing, you can check out my online course From the Ground Up at horma.school and get a glimpse of it on this very channel with Diamond 1 for free. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little video. I'll see you in the next one, either in a few weeks or in a couple of years, who knows. Cheers. Right.